Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Well, most of you know my position on the election, and I personally would not vote for either candidate, either of the major two candidates. I really dislike Trump on a visceral level. I think a lot of his policies are bad, and I think Kamala's policies are just awful. But there's people that claim that Trump is the better way to go for liberty lovers, and there's people that argue, as today's guest is, that Kamala would be the better choice. And our guest is a professor of law at George Mason University, and he is also the Kenneth B. Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute. Ilya Somin, Professor Ilya Somin. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, first of all, your perspective, your orientation, when you engage in political discussion, what is your goal?
I guess I might have different goals in different situations. Sometimes it's to just get my ideas out and to call attention to works that I've written. And sometimes it's to influence, public or elite opinion in a particular direction on particular issues, issues like property rights, housing, immigration, and others that I write about. And very occasionally, like I suppose today, we're going to talk about, the pluses and minuses of individual candidates, but that's not actually, most of what I do when I engage in public discourse. Usually I talk about issues and policies and legal doctrines rather than, specific politicians and parties.
And the unifying theme that ties them all together is that of liberty. You're an
Yes,
advocate of
liberty
freedom.
is certainly a huge part of it. In general, I want to advance two values. One is maximizing liberty, the other is maximizing human happiness. I think most of the time those two things go together, but I admit there are rare cases where they conflict, and those cases create, difficult issues.
So, would you say that you are more of a Trump opponent or a Kamala supporter?
I think definitely the former. I think both Trump and Kamala are pretty bad, but Trump is significantly worse. On Kamala's side, I think there are very few areas where she's likely to make policy better than the status quo, but those areas where she's likely to make it worse are not as large and significant as the equivalent problems with Trump. In addition, Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election and establish himself as essentially a tin horn dictator, even if that doesn't create an absolute bar against supporting him, it certainly creates a strong presumption against him. And I think he's just nowhere near overcoming that presumption. In fact, his policies are worse than Kamala's, even aside from that issue. But when you add that issue into the mix, it just creates an overwhelming argument against him.
So, he famously said, I think in a post on his Truth Social, that in cases of massive voter fraud, it's allowed for rules and regulations to be terminated, including those in the Constitution.
Yeah.
As a constitutional professor, is there anything in the United States Constitution that would allow for its termination?
Yeah. So I would say two things about that. One is there is simply absolutely no evidence that there was any such massive voter fraud. And don't take my word for it. Take the word of Trump supporters themselves who had opportunities in something like 60 court cases to present that evidence, and they failed to do so every single time, except maybe one case where they were able to prevail, but the amount of fraud they proved in that case was nowhere near enough to overturn the result, even in that state, Pennsylvania, not much less in enough states to change the election in his favor. So there just wasn't even probably a tenth or a hundredth as much voter fraud ever proven as would need to be proven to show that the election was somehow stolen for Trump. But let's say large scale voter fraud was somehow proven. Still, there's nothing in the Constitution which says, well, you can just suspend the Constitution when that happens. Rather, there are legal mechanisms that people who have evidence of actual voter fraud can use to bring cases in court. They vary somewhat in different states, but every single state has mechanisms where a losing candidate or a seemingly losing candidate, if he or she has actual evidence of voter fraud turning the election against them, they can file a case, they can go to the relevant officials and so on. And that's the way you deal with voter fraud when it does occur. It certainly isn't by somehow suspending the Constitution and saying, well, now I can do whatever I want. There is no like suspend the Constitution to do whatever I want clause in there. I think that's pretty clear.
You mentioned that I think you said 60 plus court cases. What about the argument that he was never heard out in court, that
That argument is false. In about half the cases, they did actually decide on the merits and specifically ruled that there wasn't evidence of voter fraud, including in several cases heard by Trump-appointed federal judges. And in a number of other cases, the argument was not heard on the merits because when Trump's or pro-Trump lawyers realized that they would have to present evidence, they simply withdrew their case. I think that happened, if I remember correctly, in about 14 cases. If you're interested in going over the cases in detail, there is a great publication called Lost Not Stolen, which was written by several conservative former judges and voting law experts, which goes over all 60 plus cases one by one and explains exactly what happened in each of them. I wrote a blog post about it when it came out a couple years ago. It goes through every single case and explains that indeed about half of them did reach the merits, and of those that didn't reach the merits, in many cases, they didn't reach the merits because the plaintiffs, the people who filed the case, chose to withdraw it, probably because they realized they couldn't win. So there were indeed some cases that got thrown out on procedural issues, but that's not anything like all of them.
So, from a liberty perspective and a constitutional perspective, I think one of the best things that Trump did, if probably no, but I'm going to say the best, are his Supreme Court appointments. Why doesn't the ability to appoint justices, not just to the Supreme Court, but to the judiciary in general, in the federal judiciary, why don't you lend a lot of weight to that?
I think it deserves some weight, but there are several problems with this argument. One is conservative judges are good on some issues, like, for instance, property rights issues and certain federalism issues, and I give them credit there. On the other hand, they tend to be bad in the very issues where right-wing populist presidents tend to abuse their power. Like, they tend to give a lot of deference to government immigration issues, and also here, in common with liberal judges, they also tend to give a lot of deference on trade issues. And sometimes this is more of a mixed bag on criminal justice issues as well. Sadly, conservative jurisprudence, as it's developed over the last several decades, is especially unlikely to curb abuses of power of the kind that Trump or other similar politicians are likely to engage in. That's not because the conservative jurists deliberately decided we're just going to give Trump a pass. It's because of the development of conservatism in America over the last several decades, and we can talk at another time perhaps about why that happened. A second issue is that when you have a president and a movement that threatens to undermine the entire constitutional order, then even if to the extent that's a significant threat at all, that's not something relatively better judges can possibly outweigh. And then the third problem is that both Trump and even more so his VP nominee, J.D. Vance, have said they can and should disobey judicial decisions that they don't like. Vance has openly said that on various occasions. Trump actually did that during the 2020 election after he lost, or in the aftermath rather, after he lost all those court cases. He didn't simply accept his defeat. He tried to overturn it by force and fraud. So it seems to me that when you have a political movement that threatens the foundations of the constitutional order, and whose leaders have made it clear that if there's court decisions they really don't like, they will just disobey them, that can't possibly be outweighed by appointing somewhat better judges at the margin. There's many problems with liberal judges, just as there are some problems with conservative judges, but the relatively better nature of conservative judges on some issue just can't outweigh these other problems, which is the threat to the constitutional order, plus the fact that this movement proposes to engage in enormous abuses of power in areas like immigration and trade, where current conservative justices, and in some cases liberal ones too, are particularly likely to defer to the government and therefore particularly unlikely to effectively protect liberty. We might wish there was different judicial doctrine on these issues, and I have argued that there should be, but it seems to me unlikely that the Supreme Court or lower courts are going to fully get there anytime soon.
Until recently, I thought, and I would have listed it if somebody asked me for Trump's strengths, I would have said deregulation.
Yeah.
But I've learned a little bit about it in the last couple of weeks, I think. But you specifically mentioned that his deregulation is very overblown. What do you mean?
So I think there are some good deregulations that were done in Trump's first term. Nonetheless, if you look at the University of Pennsylvania study that I cited in my post on why Kamala Harris is a lesser evil than Trump, it turns out that in the Trump administration, by standard measures, he actually did more new regulation than deregulation. In addition, the deregulation argument relies on what I think is an arbitrary definition of what counts as regulation. It omits trade regulations and tariffs, and it omits immigration restrictions, both of which in sort of ordinary language are clearly regulations and that both restrict free market activity that would otherwise take place. When you include the costs of Trump's immigration restrictions and his tariffs, that those costs measured by any plausible way massively outweigh anything he achieved through deregulation. And in his second term, or a possible second term if he has one, he proposes to do more tariffs and more immigration restrictions than before, both of which things he can probably do at least to a large extent through unilateral executive authority. On the other hand, on the deregulation front in other areas, there are now more so-called national conservatives, working for Trump than in his first term when he had more traditional Republicans, and national conservatives are big fans of regulation. J.D. Vance is like this. Many of the other people around Trump are like this. These people favor many of the same economic regulations as leftists do. They just defend them on somewhat different grounds, or as my colleague and co-author Alex Navrastek puts it, nationalism is sort of like socialism with different flags, that they favor a lot of regulation. It's even to the point where J.D. Vance has praised Lina Khan, one of the Biden administration's most aggressive regulators. And I think it's likely that the Republicans would fire Lina Khan and not keep her if they return to power, but they could easily appoint someone just as bad as she is, and if not to that post, then to others. So there will be some areas where if Trump returns to power, there would be less regulation, like on fossil fuel industries, for example. But overall, especially if you include the impact of immigration and trade restrictions, you would get more new regulations under Trump than under Kamala Harris, especially when you consider that courts tend to be more differential to federal government regulatory power when it comes to trade and immigration. On the other hand, they're somewhat less deferential in other areas, and therefore in those other areas, the areas where Kamala Harris is likely to be abusive, there will be more resistance from lawsuits and from the judiciary than when it comes to many of the areas where Trump would be at his worst.
Okay, so what would be your biggest realistic fear about a second Trump term?
I would say three things. One is could massively increase tariffs. Indeed, he has said that he would impose across the board 10% or more tariffs, which would lead to the biggest trade war and the biggest tax increase really since World War II and the Great Depression. A second fear is that he would severely cut legal immigration and also engage in mass deportations, both of which he has promised to do. That would victimize millions of potential immigrants, or in some case, immigrants who are already here, but it would also victimize many US citizens because many US citizens depend on various business and social connections and dealings with immigrants. It would damage the US economy. And even when we have the ordinary deportation regime, hundreds or thousands of US citizens get accidentally swept up into the system and detained because due process protections are weak. That number was surely likely to be much bigger if you have a much larger mass deportation regime as he proposes to do, and it would be severe damage to US economy across many spheres as well. A third fear that I have is that by starting trade wars with allies and otherwise undermining the Western alliance, Trump's measures would undermine the liberal democratic powers in the world and be a big boon to authoritarianism. Certainly, Vladimir Putin and other enemies of the United States are rooting for a Trump victory because they hope, quite possibly correctly, that he would abandon Ukraine to the tender mercies of our enemies. In addition, by starting a huge trade war with our allies, he would screw up relations with them, and that would also create opportunities for Russia and China. Trump has also made noises about possibly abandoning Taiwan to the Chinese, though there it's less clear what he would do than with Ukraine. So if you look around the world, almost all the allies of the United States are rooting against a Trump victory, whereas the major enemies of the United States, Russia and China, would like him to win. I think we should take some notice from that. And we should give more credence to the views of our friends and less to that of our enemies. Finally, even aside from these policy issues, there's the issue of Trump's threat to the constitutional order, given that he was willing to try to use force and fraud to overturn an election that he lost. There could be other authoritarian things he could try to do. In a second term, he has already said, some of them, that he would try to use law enforcement power against his critics. I do not believe that if he were to return to power, he could fully establish a dictatorship. I think that's relatively unlikely, but he could cause harm and undermine liberal democratic norms in other ways. And while Kamala Harris is not perfect in these regards, any danger she poses along those lines is way less than Trump. So sorry, that was a relatively long answer, but
It's
I give
okay.
three policy areas plus an overarching problem which cuts across specific policy differences.
I'm glad you mentioned immigration because while you're here, I'd like to ask you about something. I read a piece from Cato recently that talked about the myth that that Biden released more criminal illegals into the American population than Trump. The article claimed that given the wide net that Trump cast in his focus on asylum seekers, that he actually ended up releasing more criminal illegals into society than Biden. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so this is a piece by my colleague David Beer,
Yes.
and I agree with the point that he made, though I put somewhat less weight on it than perhaps he does. Um, Basically, his point is something like this. That the federal government has relatively limited law enforcement resources. And we have a federal system for good reason where most law enforcement personnel are actually employed by state and local governments. So relative to the amount of federal crimes out there, which, by the way, are mostly immigration and drug crimes, federal law enforcement only go after a limited number of them, right? That's true even under the most aggressive administration, including the Trump administration in his first term. So Trump, previous administrations and later the Biden administration, they basically said, if we're going to try to prioritize people for deportation, we will try to go after sort of aliens who have committed more serious crimes first. They didn't always perfectly stick to that, and you could argue about what actually counts as a serious crime, but that was the basic idea. Trump said, let's go after everybody. And if you're going after everybody, then necessarily the resources you're using to go after just people who are just working here and whose only violation of the law was crossing the border illegally and staying here. If you're going after more of those people, there's fewer resources to go after people who have committed rape, assault, murder, theft, and so on. And so as a result, if you look at the stats on how many actual criminals people had committed crimes as opposed to just immigration violations, the Trump regime actually ended up targeting them and supporting somewhat fewer than the Biden regime, which did try to restore some degree of prioritization. And I think David's point is correct insofar as it goes that if you want to prioritize deporting people who actually have committed serious crimes, then you want to sort of focus your resources more narrowly. But I also think ultimately that and I don't expect either Kamala Harris or any mainstream politician just anytime soon. But ultimately, if our goal is really to prevent violent and property crime, the kind that libertarians are concerned about, and even the kind that sort of most ordinary people are most concerned about, instead of using any resources on deportation, immigration enforcement, we could just take those resources and put them into ordinary law enforcement, abolish things like ICE, and hire more ordinary police, And that a lot of data shows would do much more to deter crime than immigration enforcement, which does very little to prevent crime. I calculate in my book Free to Move that if we just take the money currently spent on ICE and just spend it on ordinary police officers, hiring new ones, we could hire many thousands of additional police officers. And police are not a completely unadulterated good, as most libertarians will tell you. They do sometimes commit wrongs of their own, but the presence of police on the streets does deter crime, whether by immigrants or by natives, and it does so much better than any kind of deportation regime, not because the police like shoot criminals in the act or catch them, but just because even very stupid criminals, if they see some police officer out there, like, this might not be a good time for me to commit a crime, because even a relatively stupid person, despite what you see in the movies, most criminals do not actually want to get in confrontations with police and shoot it out with Clint Eastwood or whoever. So that would be my somewhat more radical view on how to deal with this, though I admit it's not going to happen anytime soon, if ever. Elsewhere, I've also argued that people who commit real crimes, murder, theft, assault, they should be severely punished. I'm all for that, but they should not be more punished if they're immigrants and if they're natives. So punish, each person who does that severely, but don't say if you're a native, you get, say, X number of years in prison, but if you're an immigrant, you get that plus also deportation. That seems to me unjust. It's not much different from saying we will punish Black people more severely than white people. In both cases, what you're essentially saying is that you're going to punish someone more based on an arbitrary circumstance of birth. You're born Black versus white, or you're born outside of the United States versus within it. But I do want to make clear that someone who commits a genuine crime, murder, rape, assault, theft, things of that sort, they should be severely punished. I'm not one of those people who says, let's abolish prisons or abolish the police or whatnot. Just don't punish people extra based on circumstances of birth.
Up until now, I'm largely in agreement with you. I think the case against Trump is a very, very strong one. What's less convincing to me is the idea that Kamala is so much better than Trump, or Trump is so much worse than Kamala, that Kamala would deserve my vote. Why do you think it's the case that people should actually vote for Kamala
Yeah.
rather
So
than
I
just
don't think
say
it's a matter
abstain?
of her deserving your vote and that like she's done something good for which she deserved to be rewarded. I don't think that's actually the case. I think there's two things going on here. One is we can at some point, perhaps later in discussion, we can look at the other side of the ledger and sort of bad stuff that Kamala might do. But my main consideration is that the bad stuff she might do is, one, ultimately not as bad because it doesn't affect the lives and freedom and happiness of millions of people to the same degree. Like there's no equivalent to mass deportations or a gigantic trade war or abandoning our allies and so forth. And second, the bad things that she does want to do are much harder for her to do unilaterally through the executive. Like everything I just mentioned that I think Trump might do is stuff that for the most part he can do with unilateral executive power. On the other hand, you look at the other side of the ledger, like some of the price controls Kamala Harris wants to impose, or the rent controls she wants to impose, or some new spending programs she wants to do. She would need Congress to pass new legislation. This will be very hard for her to do, given that it's quite likely that Republicans will control the Senate. Even if the Democrats control both houses of Congress, they will have very narrow majorities, and it will be difficult for them to pass much in the way of legislation, especially since on more controversial things, the Democrats often aren't completely united themselves. There is a difference between things the president can do on his own, which is what most of Trump's bad agenda is like, versus things the president can only do with new legislation, which is a lot, not all, but a lot of the bad things that Kamala Harris might do. There is a second issue here, given that as I said before, I don't think Kamala Harris is deserving of the vote in some sense because she's a positive good or because she has some great merit that deserves to be rewarded or something like that. There is a more general fundamental philosophical issue of is it right or just or good to vote for a lesser evil as opposed to reserving your vote purely for a positive good. I, in 2016, wrote a piece called The Case for Voting for a Lesser Evil, where I outlined the argument for why voting for a lesser evil is a desirable thing to do, at least in many elections, and why I reject some of the conventional arguments against that. We can talk about that here too, if you want to, because that issue goes beyond the specifics of Trump versus Harris. It goes to the more general issue, which libertarians, but also other people too, sometimes face, where, if you think both candidates are generally bad, then should you just not vote or vote for a third party, or should you suck it up and vote for a lesser evil? And I'm a sucking it up kind of guy and say you generally, as a general rule, you should vote for a lesser evil, but obviously there are some arguments against it.
I actually depending on exactly what we mean by evil and that sort of thing, I'm in large agreement that it's okay to pick the lesser of two evils, which is why I don't begrudge anybody in this election for voting what they perceive as the lesser of two evil, whether it be Trump or Harris. What aggravates me the most are the Trump cultists who just Trump can do no wrong. He's wonderful. He's great. That annoys me. But people that just vote because they say, for instance, they're voting for Trump, he's good on taxes. I need my taxes low. Like I'm not, I don't hate on that. But in this situation, I don't see Trump as so much worse because Kamala Harris, for instance, and depending on has she really changed her mind, what is she all of a sudden had an epiphany or what? I mean, a lot depends on that. But I know that she has favored ending the filibuster. She's favored possibly putting more judges on the Supreme Court, the price controls that you talked about, universal health care, the Green New Deal. Those things are going to affect millions and millions of people if she's able to do it. So how don't those things disqualify her in the same way that the other issues disqualify Trump?
For two reasons. One I've already noted before, which is the more extreme measures among those are things that would require new legislation that would be difficult or impossible for her to get. That's true of news. That's true of court packing. That's true of price controls. That's true of the Green New Deal, and so on. Second, she has actually withdrawn several of those positions that she took back in 2019 when she was running for the Democratic nomination. She withdrew her support for the Green New Deal. She withdrew her support for universal health care and so on. Now, that does lead to question, was she lying then or is she lying now? Or does she just not care about these issues or only take positions for the sake of getting elected? To my mind, it's largely the same scenario in all of those situations. Whatever she believes in her heart, it is clear that she is willing to retreat from these kinds of more radical positions when she perceives they're unpopular and politically disadvantageous. And it's not likely that those more extreme positions are likely to be popular within the next 2 or 3 years. And therefore, it's unlikely she will pursue them, especially if she wants to try to get reelected. All of this suggests she's kind of a Weasley politician, but I think a Weasley politician within the normal range of Weasleyness, while it's not great and it certainly doesn't mean she deserves her vote in the sense that you mentioned earlier, it does make her a lesser evil than Trump. Trump also, of course, flip-flops on a number of issues,
Sure.
but he has been consistently bad on trade, immigration, relations with America's allies, and also basic democratic norms and trying to overturn the election when he doesn't like the results. So the areas where he doesn't weasel are ones where he's especially bad, as opposed to something like abortion, where indeed he has weaseled quite a lot over the years, or banning TikTok, or things like that. So both Trump and Harris have some weaseliness there. Most politicians do, but Trump has this extra level of evil that she doesn't have. I would add also in the area of court packing, she has actually never endorsed that. Now, that doesn't mean that I can prove that deep in her heart she doesn't actually support it. I don't have special access or any privileged access to what she believes deep in her heart, but either she really is against it or she just doesn't think that it's politically advantageous to endorse it. And I would note that court packing is something that divides Democrats internally. It has for years. And if the Democrats end up with a narrow majority in both houses of Congress, which realistically is the best they're likely to be able to do in the next few years, they're not going to be able to reach consensus on that issue. They may reach consensus on some narrower Supreme Court reform. I've talked about this in some of my writings. They might impose a Supreme Court ethics code. Maybe that code will be too restrictive in terms of like how much money Supreme Court justices can take from rich people or whatever. But if Supreme Court justices do make about $300,000 per year, and I think they can live comfortably on those salaries, even if Congress goes too far with an ethics code and say bans all gifts entirely, which I think probably would not be right. But I think that's something we can live with, and we don't need to worry about Supreme Court justices ending up in the poorhouse or whatever, not being able to support their families. I think the same to some extent is true with proposals about Supreme Court term limits, where I think Supreme Court term limits actually would be a good idea if passed by a constitutional amendment. If passed purely by statute, they would raise some constitutional problems and set a bad precedent. I think it would be very difficult politically for the Democrats to pass it by statute. If they did somehow manage to do it, it would likely be struck down by the courts, and that we could live with that result.
I stand corrected about the court packing. You're right. I don't recall her ever
There are
advocating
other
that.
Democrats who have endorsed
Sure.
it.
What she was advocating is exactly what I believe is exactly what you've said, or what she's indicated
Yeah,
she'd support, something that,
yeah,
along the
yeah.
lines of
So let's
reforming
just
the
get this
court.
straight. She has supported three things that President Biden put forward. One is a constitutional amendment to limit presidential immunity, which I actually also support, and the Supreme Court decision last summer about presidential immunity, which is vague in many ways, but I think it probably gave the president more immunity than is justified. In any event, passing a constitutional amendment, which probably the Democrats will not be able to do because it's too difficult, but if they were somehow to do it, this amendment would actually be good and it wouldn't destroy the judiciary in any way. A second thing is a Supreme Court ethics code, which could potentially go too far depending on exactly what was in it. But even if it did go too far, it would be like not a great threat to the republic. Though if you're a Supreme Court justice, you might be annoyed if there are too many limits on the gifts you can take, or if you have to fill out too many forms about like, anytime somebody took you out for dinner or something like that and paid for the pizza or whatever. And then the third is term limits, which is not entirely clear how they would do that. As I said before, term limits for Supreme Court justices, I think, and actually most legal scholars, even right of center ones, think would be a good idea. But I would be worried if it was done by statute, not by a constitutional amendment.
Well, the Constitution says the justices serve during times of good behavior.
Yeah.
So in
So
order, you'd have to amend the
yeah,
Constitution,
I
right?
agree with you. There are certain legal scholars who argue that it can be done without amending the Constitution. We could probably have a whole different program devoted to this question. But they have what I consider somewhat Weasleyan and implausible arguments. But there are some who think, that good behavior, that for instance, after a certain period of time on the Supreme Court, you could force the justice off, and they could be on some other federal court, and so they would still be federal judges, quote unquote, serving during good behavior, but they'd no longer be Supreme Court justices. They'd be like on a court of appeals, or maybe adjudicating parking tickets on federal property or something like that. So I think ultimately these arguments don't work. But they do exist. I also think if this issue were to get to the Supreme Court justices probably would not be too happy about statutory term limits that might force them off the court, and therefore I think it's unlikely that they would rule in favor of the arguments that that these other legal scholars advance to suggest that this kind of measure would be constitutional without an amendment.
Now, you mentioned the unlikelihood that she would be able to get through her agenda. If she went to a far left agenda, it'd be difficult for her to get it through Congress. But if she were to have, say, 51 senators as Democrats in a majority in the House, and they kill the filibuster, she could get through a lot more than she would otherwise. That doesn't concern you?
It concerns me much less than what Trump might do just through unilateral executive power. If the Democrats have a narrow Senate majority, it would still be difficult for them to pass a far left agenda for two reasons. One is they might not choose to kill the filibuster because they might worry about what Republicans will do next time Republicans have a majority. Secondly, even if they do kill the filibuster or try to kill it in a limited way, then then you would still have the issue that not all 51 Democratic senators are going to be sort of far left types. There are various divisions in the Democratic caucus. For example, the Democrats cannot get to 51 senators unless John Tester is reelected in Montana. And to maintain his political brand in the very conservative state of Montana, he has to work hard to like show that he's not far left. And there are several other Democratic senators, like in Ohio and elsewhere, they're not in quite as difficult a position as Tester is in, but they do face some difficult trade-offs. So if the Democrats had like 55 or 60 senators, they wouldn't need to worry what John Tester thinks about anything. They could just kill the filibuster and do what they want. But at best, the Democrats will end up with their current 51 senators, and more likely, actually, the Republicans will have a Senate majority. For what it's worth, 538 predicts there's like an 83% chance of the Republicans having a Senate majority after this election. I wouldn't hang my hat on precisely that number. These kind of projections are imperfect. But if you look at the Senate map, the Democrats are almost certainly going to be down one seat that they currently have, the West Virginia one, which they have virtually no chance of winning. And elsewhere, they have more chances of losing other seats and of gaining them.
So before I let you go, this all is about voting lesser of two evils. And you
Sure.
said that you have reasons for why that's okay. So apart from this case, just as an abstract principle, why do you support the idea of voting lesser of two evils?
Sure. So as I see it, so let's assume second that we have an electoral system like we have in the US, where for the presidency and for the vast majority of other offices most of the time, there's really only two candidates who have a plausible chance of winning, the Democrat or the Republican, as opposed to like a proportional representation system that exists in some other countries where things are different. Then the question is, say you don't like, and I certainly don't like either of the major party candidates, should you vote for a lesser evil? And my answer is that in cases like this, you should try to maximize the likelihood that your action will have beneficial results. And in the vast majority of cases, one vote is very unlikely to have any result at all, because the chance that your one vote will change the outcome of a presidential election is about 1 in 60 million. It's a bit higher if you live in a swing state. It's lower if you live in a state like California, which is far from being a swing state. But let's go with that, 1 in 60 million or 1 in 100 million number. You say, well, that's really low, and so maybe it doesn't matter what you do. And however, if there is a big difference in quality or a big difference in badness between the two major candidates, that if you think that it's so much that on average for each American citizen, there would be a loss equivalent to, say, $5,000 from the worst candidate winning, or a benefit equivalent to $5,000 from the better candidate winning. I'm not going to do the math in front of you right now, but if you do that math, it turns out that there's a real expected utility from voting for the lesser evil, because when you multiply 300 million Americans by $5,000 and then you divide that by 100 million, you still get a meaningful number, and you get more perhaps if you consider harm done to non-Americans as well. And by harm, I mean not just direct financial losses, but the total harm or benefit, like people being killed or hurt in ways that are not easily quantifiable. That matters too. So there is some expected utility there. It may be several hundred or even $1,000 or something like that on this crude metric that I set up. Therefore, I think that justifies your voting for a lesser evil. You might consider the other alternatives, like let's just not vote at all. The expected utility of that is zero, right? Like you get, except maybe you save a little bit of time from going to the polls. So maybe that's $5 or something, but it's less than this, than this difference between than the expected value of voting for the lesser evil. You might say, well, I will instead vote for a third party candidate. And I'm not going to go through the different third party candidates. Many of them I think are pretty bad anyway. Like I think Jill Stein is awful. RFK Jr., where he's still on the ballot, he's awful. Cornel West is still awful. I have mixed feelings about the Libertarian Party candidate. I think is very good on some issues, but bad on others. But let's say there's a third party candidate you really like. Still, by assumption, he or she has zero chance of winning. So there's no chance that you can get that person. There's not even a 1 in 60 million or 1 in 100 million chance that you can get that person over the hump. But you might say, well, but I can send a message, right? So even if I can't cause Jill Stein or whoever to win the election, still, maybe I can send a message. However, there is a zero chance essentially that one marginal vote for a third party candidate will lead to the message being interpreted differently than it would be otherwise. Like say I cast a vote for Chase Oliver, so instead of a million votes, he gets 1,000,001. There's zero chance that the difference between 1,000,001 and 1,000,000 will be perceived in such a way that it will change and make a difference. So there is no point at which a marginal vote for a third party candidate has any chance of changing an outcome, whereas a marginal vote for a major party candidate, there's an infinitesimally small chance that it will matter. And if it does matter, there is this huge payoff. So if you follow that, that logic, then even if you do like one of the third party candidates much better, then still it makes sense to vote for the lesser evil in an election where the third party candidate has zero meaningful chance of winning, which I think is certainly true this year. There's another set of arguments we can talk about, well, if you vote for a lesser evil candidate, you can argue you're sort of morally responsible for the bad stuff that that person does in office. I have response to that argument too, and we can talk about it if you want.
No, I don't. That's going to take us way into the weeds. but
Sure.
but
But
I
that's
have
my basic
yeah.
argument for voting
Yeah.
for a lesser
But
evil. They're
I
obvious.
happen to agree with you, though. The idea that once you pass a vote for somebody, you are now responsible for everything that person does is absolutely ridiculous. You're given a limited amount of choices. You have to live in the country. So to say that somebody who's trying to minimize the harm done to them then becomes responsible for everything the person does is just that's absurd
That's
to
right.
me.
I sometimes hear that argument. If you voted for X, you're responsible for
Yeah,
everything
that's
X
just
does.
dumb.
I think at least the vast majority of the time that is not true.
Yeah, so do I. Okay, Professor, before I let you go, is there anything that I forgot to ask you or anything you think needs to be said in furtherance of your case?
So I will merely say, if you want to go into the case in more detail, I wrote a piece on the Reason Magazine website and the Vola Conspiracy blog, which is hosted there, called "Why Kamala Harris is a Much Lesser Evil Than Donald Trump." You can Google that in my name, and you can read it for free. There's also links there to my more general arguments for voting for a lesser evil, which are not linked to this particular election. Also, some readers or listeners may be interested in my piece from a couple of months ago, which explains why nationalism is a bigger danger than wokeness. Because I think for libertarians or some conservatives who are wondering whether voting for Kamala Harris makes sense, for many of them, sort of the fear of wokeness is a big influence. Not something we talked about today much, but it's out there. And I agree, actually, wokeness is bad, but in that piece, I explain why the nationalism advocated by Trump is actually worse and a bigger threat. Among other things, nationalism is actually more popular than wokeness, and therefore, precisely because it has a bigger base and can more easily be implemented through unilateral executive actions, it is more of a danger as opposed to with wokeness, where some woke stuff that Democrats would like to do, they fear to do it or can't do it because it's too unpopular. And also, with Kamala Harris, if you view her, I think, correctly as sort of a Weasley politician, that means that she can't also be a deeply committed woke ideologue, right? I didn't cover that aspect in that piece, but if she is a Weasley politician, that probably means she is not Ta-Nehisi Coates or Ibram Kendi or one of these people who's like a deeply committed woke ideologue. She's a politician who wants to be in power and prioritizes that. And that's not a particularly admirable type of person. And, it's not somebody that I would set up as a role model for my daughter, even though I do think, it would be somewhat of a milestone to have a woman president. But a normal Weasley politician, while not great, is less bad than an authoritarian nationalist who also has terrible judgment like Trump.
When you said woke ideologue, I could swear you were going to say a woke idiot. So I
So
said,
not all woke idiots. Some woke ideologues are also idiots. I think most are actually not. Wokeness appeals to more intellectual types of people. It's not only intellectual types of people who like wokeness, but uh, on average, it may be that the committed woke ideologue has more IQ points than the average person, but that doesn't mean that that person is right. Being smart is not a guarantee of being right. And there are some bad ideas, of which wokeness is one, that tend to appeal disproportionately to smart people. There are other bad ideas, nationalism, fascism, that tend to appeal disproportionately to non-intellectual people. And in some ways, those kinds of bad ideas are worse because they actually have a broader appeal, because there's more people out there who are not intellectuals than people who are.
All right. So where can people find you?
Sure. So you can just Google my name and find my website, which has links to a lot of my writings. You can also find me at the Volokh Conspiracy blog, Volokh, at the Reason Magazine website, where I regularly write blog posts, including about issues related to voting and democracy, and you can read it all there for free.
And what about Cato? You're at Cato too, aren't
Yes.
you?
So I am as you mentioned, I'm the B. Kenneth Simon Fellow in Constitutional Studies at Cato. If you go to the Cato Institute website, I have a page there which also has links to a lot of my writings and also some of my video appearances. I suspect this podcast will end up on that site as well.
Excellent. Professor Somin, thank you so much for taking your time to be with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Till next time.